Hey folks, a few hints on the triple comparison today. Very exciting. I want to emphasize right away this assignment is about comparing and contrasting the text. Do not just give a summary of each one. I know what's in the text. You don't need to tell me. It's not a challenge for you to just summarize the text, so don't do that. Do the comparison and contrast. Think thematically. I'll remind you again at the end. I want to give just a little bit of background, maybe make the assignment a little easier. The first few decades of the 20th century was a period of tremendous transformation in American society. The US was rapidly becoming more urbanized, more industrialized. We've talked about already how the food system is completely changing. And with that, growing concerns about public health. We've seen a little bit about the adulteration of foods, food safety, degenerative diseases, and the consequence of modern lifestyles. We've read a number of texts already about dyspepsia, indigestion, responding to the diseases of luxury that were starting to be seen in the US. At the same time, medical culture is also transforming. Doctors are becoming more professionalized. We've seen just this week the meteoric rise of nutritional science, and this is happening in all kinds of medical fields. So, what it means to be a doctor, the amount of information you need, the amount of knowledge there is to know, the science research, the medical research is happening so fast. It's a completely different situation to be a doctor in the early 20th century. The germ theory of disease, probably heard of it. 1890s is kind of where it's introduced, but by 1920s, the time the texts we're looking at this week are written, it's been widely accepted, right? So biochemistry, they didn't really call it that at the time, but sort of idea of combining biology and chemistry, bacteriology, these are the new paradigms of medical research. Meanwhile, on a broader cultural note, progressive era reform. We've talked about this a lot. I talked about this a lot in the overview video. It's in the readings, 1890s to 1920s, fundamentally shaping public attitudes towards health, cleanliness, morality, patriotism, self-discipline, all part of diet culture starting in the early 20th century. Reformers, we've seen Graham, we see Kellogg this week. Progressive era reformers saw physical health as essential, not a bonus, essential to productive citizenry and a healthy nation. This translated into interest in diet as both a personal responsibility and a moral obligation, a national imperative. If we want to be a strong country, we have to eat right. And of course, the question is, well, what does that mean? The USDA food guides, as we saw on Monday, start to give national advice about what is right. A few key developments, specifically in terms of diet and health. Many of these I mentioned in the overview video. Repetition is a great way to learn. It's important to keep these in mind, trying to think how these texts relate to each other. So I just want to review a couple things very quickly. Rise, number one, most importantly, rise of scientific nutrition. Calories, energy in, energy out. Eat the amount that you need to do the work that you need to do. Related to that, the birth of modern nutritional science. The way we think about nutrition, nutrition research, the paradigms of health and nutrition, what we do now started in the 19 teens, 1920s. This is the origin. This is what we're reading about this week. These are the seminal texts that kind of launched the way people are thinking about it. It's not just these particular texts. Obviously, it's a broader thing, but they are representative. They are very early, and we see the foundation that they make. The second main point I want you to keep in mind is the confluence of moral, religious, cultural, racial dimensions of diet. I blathered on and on about this in the overview video. You read about it Monday and Tuesday, so you're probably good. I just want to emphasize that we already talked a lot about dietary advice often reflected anxieties about national strength, especially in the face of immigration. And there's lots of discussions about racial purity that come up in the context of dietary advice. Reformers often targeted, as we've seen this week, working class immigrants promoting American diets to replace the unhygienic, inefficient, wasteful traditional diets of various immigrants, which is terrible. I mean, like that's to me, that's what makes American food great. It's a combination of a million different things, right? If you have ever thought about American food and want to know more, there's a whole class on it in the fall, right? Regular face-to-face class. Anyway, health reform often served as a tool of assimilation and class control. Okay, so big picture things that you already knew about for this week. I just want to make sure you keep those in mind as you're doing your assignment. One last big picture point to keep in mind that we don't have time to talk about in this compressed course is the commercialization and popularization of various foods and diets. The food industry just explodes in the late 19th, early 20th centuries because industrialization, urbanization is exploding. So there's all these new products you can get. And health foods are a big part of what people are making. We saw this with graham crackers. We'll talk about cornflakes in a second. Vitamins become huge consumer items, still are in many ways, but they're brand new in the 1920s. So there's this huge industry still going strong, billions, trillions of dollars. Now, cookbooks, pamphlets, lectures, magazines, continually bringing new nutritional ideas into middle class houses, often directed at women, often blending scientific authority with domestic advice. There's this huge gender divide in terms of diet and health literature. Basically, everything we're reading now is starting to be directed at women who are in charge of families, feeding families, keeping them healthy, keeping the nation healthy, right? Growing robust, well-meaning, well-virtued, well-disciplined citizens. And so women have this tremendous responsibility for cooking, obviously all this shopping. They have to be frugal, they have to be economical, they have to get the right nutrients in the bodies of their family, moral instruction, cleanliness. It's insane, right? And it continues. So diet is fascinating in the early 20th century because it's one site, it's I think a unique site actually where ideas about industrialization, modernization, urbanization, what other zations can I get? Nationalism, morality, science, medicine, health. And you can see all these things coming together in what seems to be a very ordinary kind of treatise on diet and health, right? A really different kind of thing now, dietary manuals, than we've looked at in the pre-modern world. Okay, first text, Diet and Health with Key to the Calories, 1918. Lulu Hunt Peters lived around 1870 to 1930, so kind of right around 1900. She's a physician. Less than 5%, I think, of physicians in the early 20th century were women. Nutritionist, best-selling author, that's why we're reading her. Really pivotal role in shaping early 20th century American attitudes towards diet, weight, body image, self-control, moral virtue. Best known for her 1918 book that we're skimming today, one of the first big bestseller diet books in the US, stayed in print for many, many, many years. Peters was immediately famous for popularizing calorie counting. That fad hasn't gone away. You can get apps for your phone where it counts the calories for you. But she very deliberately and very charismatically, as you'll see, reframed weight loss as a matter of personal responsibility and moral discipline. And she couches a lot of what she says in this very sort of patriotic language. She's writing during World War I, right? The text is published in 1918, which is the year the war ends. But she's writing where there's rationing. We need to send food overseas to the troops. Eating more than your share is seen as bad. I've kind of read about this for today, but you see this in her text firsthand. She's not a laboratory scientist like McCollum. She's not making all these crazy new nutrition discoveries, but her impact is, at least culturally, as large. She cements the idea that thinness equals health and virtue. And she's not the only person talking about this, obviously, but her impact because of this book and how she's relating thinness and body image and virtue and health together, that's still with us. That legacy continues to shape body image and diet discourse today. So a few themes to look out for in her text that I hope you'll comment on. Calories, as central, obviously. Following Atwater, who we read about Wednesday, but totally different level, totally different style, etc. So have fun with that. Style, second thing to notice, right? Very wry sense of humor, very candid personal anecdotes, accessible scientific explanations. Think about how she's establishing her expertise. She's a medical doctor, but you don't really get that sense from reading the text, right? But that's part of the appeal, is it's kind of this everyday kind of person way of explaining calories and why people should care and how they can master themselves and make the country better and so on. Still stresses a balanced lifestyle. The third point, the calorie is really far away from anything we read about in pre-modern medicine, right? This individual unit of work, and you have to be very efficient about what goes in and what goes out. It couldn't be further from Galen, but the ideas of balance, moderation, sustainable habits, resisting extremes, that's core of pre-modern medicine. Hippocrates, Galen, we're still seeing it in Lulu Hunt Peters. There's a lot of great quotes in this book. I just want to tell you one. This is a free country. You can eat as much as you please. But remember this, you must pay the penalty. Not price, penalty. And this captures her whole central philosophy, right? You have the freedom of choice. Early 20th century, the amount of food, the availability of food, the price of food, everything is just amazing compared to even a generation prior. But you have to be governed by personal restraint. You can have all this stuff, but you won't. And that makes you a better person, right? Moral and civic virtue and national responsibility. Incidentally, slight sidebar here, but you're used to these. I was goofing around with AI to see how well it could summarize these Google books in different ways, and I didn't get it to work out very well. But it was telling me the influence of these different authors and so on. And one note it made about Peters was, quote, this is an AI quote, "She transformed dieting from fringe advice to mainstream practice." Which, if you've been awake for 2 seconds in this class, you know that there's nothing fringy about dietary advice. It's been central. Pre-modern books, manuscripts, it's been everywhere, right? There's nothing at all marginal about telling people how to be healthy, right? That market has existed. Atwater wouldn't have been writing in Century Magazine to this huge audience explaining the calorie if dietary advice had been fringe. It's so easy for AI to just kind of make up its own little world. But it doesn't know anything, right? It's just putting statistics together to put words together that seem to make sense. Okay, so that's enough of that. Moving on to our second text, John Harvey Kellogg, The New Dietetics. John Harvey Kellogg, 1850 to 1940, roughly. American health reformer. He was a devout Seventh-day Adventist. He had a lot of chronic illnesses when he was a kid and a young adult. He came to believe that they were the result of poor diet and lifestyle. And he tells similar anecdotes like, as Graham did, I was sick and then I figured it out. And now I'm going to tell you, advocate for vegetarianism, exercise, temperance, regular bowel movements, keep everything moving, right? Very similar to Graham in a lot of ways, but also writing in a very different time period in terms of nutritional research. He was director of the Battle Creek Sanitarium, Battle Creek, Michigan. Beautiful place with lots of trees, water, clean air, very far away from cities, which were foul and smelly. And there's a lot of people, and there's chamber pots being dumped outside, and there's horses in the street all the time, and it's hot and humid. Yeah, not a great place to be in terms of health, right? So people would go to these sanitariums. There's a bunch around the country. There's a lot in New Mexico. Tuberculosis cures happen at these kinds of places. So sanitarium just means place of health. So he's in charge of like the biggest and arguably the most famous one. Lots of middle class Americans and especially upper class Americans are going to these places to get away from the city and recover their health. At the sanitarium, Kellogg promoted what he called biologic living, which is kind of like living according to your biology or your nature, right? Natural diet. Awesome. He was interested in hydrotherapy, light therapy, so using water and light to enact cures, which obviously that's kind of faded away. But an austere diet, strict moral discipline, emphasis on sort of natural air, natural water. Early advocate of what we call probiotics now, fiber-rich foods, whole grains. A lot of his dietary advice seems kind of almost ahead of its time, growing out of all this new research that's being done in nutrition. He invented a number of health foods that he served to his patients at the sanitarium. You've probably heard of one of them, cornflakes. If you buy Kellogg's cereal now, you'll notice there's a big signature at the bottom. That's Will Kellogg. That's his brother. They had a big fight about whether or not they should put sugar in their breakfast cereal. So as a health reformer, as a social reformer, John Harvey Kellogg was like, no way, we can't do this. Will Kellogg was like, we're going to make a lot of money. And if you've gone to the cereal aisle, you know who won that argument. So the Kellogg business kind of goes to Will. Sanitarium business kind of stays with John Harvey. And when the signature was meant to indicate authenticity, right? You're not buying a knockoff product because there was a million of them, just like there are now. You were buying the original one. So signatures on products in the early 20th century were really common. But cornflakes is kind of one of the most well known because it's the original box. If you've seen it, it's all white with a big signature on it. A progressive health reformer, Kellogg had a lot of ideas that I just mentioned a second ago were kind of seems like ahead of his time, but he also later in life became this sort of bonkers eugenicist and founded the Race Betterment Foundation, where he thought certain people, immigrants, poor people should be sterilized. Racial segregation was really important for him, kind of went kind of nuts. But that's part of his legacy, right? And so it's an example, though, of how this science of nutrition, about genetics, how the science of sort of making us better, making us healthy can go in undesirable directions. And a lot of this sort of language that we see in health reformers in the early 20th century, we see again in Nazi Germany. A few key features to look for in his text that I hope you'll relate in your comparison and contrast. Emphasis on the physiology of eating. The first thing he says in his table of contents, which you should definitely look at, is food as fuel. And then there's this big section with all these sort of subsections, all about the physiology of eating, how our body processes food. So it's clearly a holdover from what we've seen in Cheney and sort of other texts, but he's got a different language now because the way of nutrition research is changing. The second feature I want you to be on the lookout for is the evidence-based approach that he's constantly promoting. He's always talking about how much scientific analysis goes into what he's doing at the sanitarium, clinical observations, experimentation, all this experience he's gained over decades of treating hundreds, thousands of patients. It's kind of the sanitarium's kind of a laboratory for him. So he has all this expertise that he's gotten as a practicing physician, trying to restore people to health. And it's using the latest nutritional research in this medical setting. So a very different kind of situation than we've seen. Kellogg is a really fascinating transitional figure because when you read his text, it reminds you of Cheney, of Graham, of Atwater, of all the people we've been reading recently. But you're also seeing this new language of science, this new nutritional research. So there's really a clear effort to bridge these two different worlds. And speaking of new worlds, we're going in a new direction with the last text, The Newer Knowledge of Nutrition, Elmer McCollum. The preservation of vitality is in the subtitle. That's really important. We'll come back to that in a second. So this was published in 1922. Kellogg is 1921. It's not that a ton of stuff happened in this one year, but it's an illustration of how books published about the same time can be completely different. That's how fast things are changing. But again, this is reflecting, McCollum's text is reflecting about 10 years of work, of research that's being done. Elmer McCollum lived 1880 to almost 1970, pioneering nutrition scientist, worked at University of Wisconsin and later Johns Hopkins University's huge centers for nutrition research. One thing McCollum did that was really new in terms of dietary research, meticulous experiments on rats, feeding them different things, denying them different foods, trying to focus on what specific foods did, what combinations of food did in terms of rats. And so rats you can study a lot really quickly. This completely shifts nutrition research from broad dietary thinking that we've been reading about to identifying specific nutrients and looking very specifically at chemical compounds and how they interact with the body. That's obviously driving modern contemporary research in 2025, right? He's laying the foundation for that. 1913, him and a colleague, Marguerite Davis, identified a fat-soluble substance, later named vitamin A, necessary to prevent growth failure and eye disease, right? This is why you eat carrots that have a lot of vitamin A. Beta-carotene, which is the yellow part, also our body converts that into vitamin A. Discovery was one of the first to prove that you could get a certain disease by missing a certain nutrient. Never seen that before in the history of diet and health. Right? That's a very different kind of thinking. One last point to mention about McCollum, passionate advocate for public health education, right? So he's doing this really detailed, groundbreaking nutrition research, but he's also equally committed to making sure people understand the basics of this newer nutrition. And it really is not just newer, it's a totally different paradigm. And his popular writings, he wrote a lot for McCall's magazine, which is very similar to the New Century Illustrated magazine that Atwater published in. And he's introducing in his columns in this book that we're reading the concept of protective foods, milk, leafy greens, fruits, whole grains, different kinds of fibers, a lot of the same stuff that we now advocate as reduces risk for X, Y, and Z. Okay, a couple of themes to look out for in McCollum's text that, again, I hope you put in your comparison and contrast. The vital role of individual nutrients, amino acids, vitamins, different minerals. And it's not, again, I can't overstate this. It's not just that, oh, we know about vitamins now. There's these things that we need. It's a totally different way of thinking about nutrition and health. Now we know definitively that if you don't get this thing in your body, you get a certain disease, not just kind of ill health. You don't just get sick, you get a particular disease. That link was completely unknown until McCollum's research. And he's not the only person doing it, obviously, but he's kind of the spokesperson for it and pioneering a lot of the methods, pioneering a lot of the studies. But dietary thinking is never the same after this newer nutrition. Second point to emphasize, just like I've mentioned for Peters, the emphasis on balance and a regulated diet. Optimal health is from variety and balance, right? So again, pre-modern medicine mixing with the absolute latest in nutrition research. And there's this confluence of these core values still going strong, even after thousands of years and completely different ways of thinking about nutrition. The last point I want to mention about McCollum is his emphasis on the links between diet and vitality. So we read recently a lot about indigestion, dyspepsia, general ills that needed to be solved or prevented by good diet. McCollum's taking this to the next level. He's not just talking about preventing indigestion or kind of ill health. He's talking about energy levels, physical performance, cognitive capacity, prevention of disease. Like this is all fundamentally linked to diet. Okay. Now, the idea that diet controls a lot of our health is not new, as you know, but the language he's using, the research he has, right? His experiments on rats is the very detailed chemical analysis of what's going on is for sure new. And so now we have a different way of talking about these links and a different way of researching them. And now we have a new challenge, though, of relating this very microscopic, invisible biochemical research into dietary advice. A lot of stuff's changing in the early 20th century. when you think about sort of the stuff we've been reading, the primary sources we've been reading recently, it's easy to see kind of a decline in the overt morality in dietary advice. When you think about Graham, we read Kellogg, Peters, you saw Atwater on Wednesday. When you get to McCullum, it kind of looks like the morality is kind of going away, and it's certainly less. But I'd encourage you to think about, like Bitlikoff does on Tuesday, that it's still there. There's still kind of this assumption that because we now know how to be healthy, you should do it. Science says, here's what you should do. Here's what you need to eat. Here's how you can prevent these diseases. And there's kind of this assumption that people will want to do that. And there is kind of an assumption that if you don't do it, something's a little off. Like, what's wrong with you? Why don't you want to be healthy? Why don't you want to be thin? Can you just choose not to be healthy? Is that okay? In the early 20th century, no, it wasn't. You were supposed to. You had a civic duty, you had a moral duty to yourself, to your body, to your health, to your family, and so on. There's a lot of different sort of ideals that go into thinking about what constitutes health, even in the most scientific literature. So as you're reading McCullum, you're not going to see the same kind of language as Graham or even Kellogg. But this idea that science is giving us the answers and we have some obligation to follow it, that's still there. There's still an obedience to science that's kind of expected there. And this idea that science is showing us the way becomes foundational for all the food guides and stuff that you read about on Monday and Tuesday. As you go through the text, please employ the same strategies that we talked about in the other video and that you use for those other texts. Skimming the preface, the table of contents, always super important. Go through the different sections, get a sense of the style, get a sense of the language, get a sense of the topics, how much space is dedicated to different things. Spending 5 minutes just skimming through the text gives you a really solid foundation. Obviously, there's a ton you are skipping, which is fine, but you get a really good sense of what this person's doing, how they're doing it. We're not going to master these texts in this assignment, but you should be able to understand kind of the text as a whole, right? And you get that from 5-10 minutes of just kind of sampling. Again, don't just describe the text in your assignment. That's not the assignment. Compare and contrast and think of the same questions, the same themes that have been in every red box on all the assignments. Okay. Just to remind you, how is the language similar and different? How is the rhetoric of diet and health being used? What are the ways of establishing expertise? How much does personal responsibility, civic duty, moral obligation show up in these texts? Where is it kind of overt? Where is it more hidden? What ideas or ideals about health are reflected in the authors, right? And they may be very explicit about it, but it also may be kind of between the lines. So keep focused on those questions. I look forward to your responses. That's it for this video. See you in the next one. More foods available, more different kinds of foods, worries about more different kinds of foods. It doesn't make any sense. In theory, it's easy to see that in theory, it's easy to construct a narrative that from 1900 to 1920, kind of nutrition literature, like we read it for today in McCullum, talking about vitamins and research. It's easy to see this period marks it. It's easy to see this period early the 20th century. In theory, okay, about health underlie what's going on in these texts. Okay, so all these are reflected very differently in what's going on with the light.